We've begun talking about biomolecules, the molecules of life. And you've already learned that biomolecules are in the larger category of organic molecules. And organic molecules are molecules that are built basically out of carbon with other elements like hydrogen and nitrogen and sulfur and oxygen added to the carbon. And you've already learned the four major categories of biomolecules. The simplest are the carbohydrates. We're going to start there. Then lipids, which are also known as fats. Also proteins. And proteins, you're going to learn are my favorites. And then nucleic acids, and nucleic acids make up the genetic material of life on planet Earth. So before we get going any further, I want you to know the difference between polymers and monomers, all right? Polymers are large molecules, often enormous molecules, that are made out of smaller repeating molecular subunits. And those smaller repeating molecular subunits are known as monomers. So you can think of a polymer as being like a long train, and it's made out of lots of train cars. Ultimately, there are some carbohydrates like starches that are huge polymers, and the individual train cars, the monomers that makes up a starch, are individual sugars like glucose. Some people, instead of thinking of a train, they think of a necklace being the polymer and the beads that make up the necklace as being the monomers. Now, the monomers are not atoms. The monomers are molecules themselves. They're just smaller molecules. So carbohydrates are the simplest of the biomolecules, and these are more structural formulas for glucose. And I'm showing them for a reason, because it's going to be on exam 1. All right. So let's talk about carbohydrates. First of all, carbohydrates got called that because they're basically carbon plus water in terms of their molecular formula. So let's look at that. Let's do blue. Oops, let's do a pen. Okay, so carbon and water, H2O, right? So earlier I showed you that glucose, which is a monosaccharide, a carbohydrate, is C6H12O6, right? It is carbohydrate, right? That's how they got their names. Now, if I show you a molecule on exam 1 that just has got carbons, hydrogen, and oxygen in the molecular formula like this, and if I've got the same number of oxygens as I have carbons, you're dealing with a carbohydrate, because carbohydrates are the only one of our molecules that look like this. Another hint about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates either are monosaccharides or they're built out of monosaccharides. And in water, and living cells are always in water, they are a 6-sided ring like that, or like that, much more better. So if you ever see a molecule, carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, then it's a carbohydrate, particularly if it's got the same number of carbons as oxygens. Now, I want to show you something. So this is drawing glucose, the carbohydrate, the simple sugar, with all of its carbons and all of its oxygens and all of its hydrogens. This over here is a real abbreviated version. You know, someone, probably a real smart student, got tired of drawing all of these carbons whenever they were drawing a carbohydrate. And they said to themselves, can't we just assume that wherever the corners are, there's going to be a carbon? And someone said, yeah, that's a really good idea. And so these are 3 different ways of representing glucose. Actually, if you add this one, 4 different ways of recognizing glucose. Oh, if you look at the name, 5 different ways of representing glucose in a textbook. All right. So Carbohydrates are often referred to as polysaccharides. Polysaccharides technically would represent a carbohydrate that's made out of lots of individual monosaccharides. The monosaccharide is the monomer, and the monomers are monosaccharides, and the polymer is going to be the polysaccharide. Now, in between monosaccharides and polysaccharides, there also are these guys, disaccharides. And in this course, we'll talk about a couple of disaccharides. Sucrose is one disaccharide. Lactose is another disaccharide. You'll recognize it's a disaccharide because it's got two rings put together. If it's a single ring, then it's a monosaccharide. Right? Carbohydrates are really important versions of energy for the human body. That's actually the most important reason that the human body has carbohydrate. We put glucose in our bloodstream. As a matter of fact, whenever someone's talking about their blood sugar, perhaps if they're a diabetic, they're talking about glucose dissolved in the watery part of the blood. And we use that kind of like having cash in your pocket. If you ever need to pay for something real easily, you need cash in your pocket. That's like glucose in the bloodstream. And then the human body also uses glucose as a storage form of energy, but quick storage. So we will store some of our energy in the form of a carbohydrate that looks like that is technically a starch, and it is known as glycogen. Glycogen sometimes gets called animal starch, and it is a polymer of glucose. So you've got glucose like this in your bloodstream, but if you just had a meal, your liver's going to go, man, that's a lot of glucose. I'm going to store some away for a couple hours from now when you might get hungry again. And your liver and your muscles will store all of those glucoses in the form of glycogen, either in the liver or in the muscle. And then when it's been a few hours since you ate, your liver or your muscle will start cutting it apart and will push these guys out into the bloodstream, and then you'll have glucose in your blood again. But not all carbohydrates can be digested by humans. Like the starch that's in oatmeal, we can digest that mostly. The starch that is in rice or potatoes, that we can digest, and we can use that as energy for our bodies. But we can't digest all carbohydrates. The outside of a lobster made out of carbohydrate, yeah. For lobsters and insects, carbohydrate is structural, not in the human body, but in insects and lobsters. But if you ate a lobster shell, even though the lobster shell is made out of carbohydrate, you won't get any nutrition out of it. Cotton fiber or wood fiber is also made out of carbohydrate. It's a type of starch. And so what you're writing on as you're taking notes, or if you're wearing cotton, technically a complex carbohydrate, sort of like starch, except for when humans cannot digest it, we will refer to it as being fiber. So far we have talked about carbohydrates. We know that sugars are the monomers, that the simple carbohydrates are monosaccharides, which end up looking kind of like a simple ring like that, might have hydrogens and oxygens sticking off the sides, and that the complex carbohydrates are either starches, like in rice or potato or corn, or glycogen, that's the carbohydrate that the human animal makes to store its glucose, or it can be things like cellulose, which ends up being fiber for us. We can't digest it. Now, the second most common biomolecule and simplest are the fats that are also called lipids. Now, lipids are not truly polymers. However, lipids are made, the most common lipid is one that we're showing here, this one and this one. These are triglycerides. Triglycerides are the most common fats, not only the most common fats in our diet, but also the most common fats in the human body. And if you look at their formula, you'll see that they've got a lot of carbons and not very much oxygen. So like, look at this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Okay, I don't know. We've probably got 60 carbons there. How many oxygens do we have? We just have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 oxygens. So with a carbohydrate, if I had 20 carbons, I'd have 20 oxygens. With a lipid, I could have 20 carbons and only, in this case, 6 oxygens. All right? So carbohydrates are different from lipids. Lipids are not polymers, but they are made out of smaller subunits that are called fatty acids. Fatty acids. So it's not really correct to say that the fatty acid is the monomer of the lipid, but I could say, what is the building block for lipids? And the answer I will want to hear are fatty acids. Now, carbohydrates mostly will dissolve in water. The reason that carbohydrates will dissolve in water is that carbohydrates are mostly polar molecules, and water is a polar molecule. Remember polar covalent bonds? And the polar dissolves in polar, okay? But lipids are not polar. And so lipids will not dissolve in water. Lipids won't dissolve in water because they are non-polar. And that is why oil and water don't mix. If you put oil and water together and blend them up or cook them together, whatever you want to do, they will not mix together because water is polar and lipids, particularly triglycerides, are non-polar. Alrighty? So fats, lipids, they're often made out of fatty acids. Here's a fatty acid. It's got this long carbon chain here. At one end, it's got this acid part called a carboxyl. You don't have to know that. But you do need to know that fatty acids could be saturated or unsaturated. Saturated or unsaturated. Well, let's test your mastery of structural formulas. You can see in this molecule, stearic acid, that each carbon is attached to the adjacent carbon by a single covalent bond. How do we know? One little stick, one little stick, one little stick, right? Each individual single line is a single covalent bond. Why are there just single covalent bonds between the adjacent carbons in the chain of stearic acid? Because each of those carbons is, quote, saturated with hydrogens. That means each of the carbons in a stearic acid are holding as many hydrogens as they possibly can. And so stearic acid is a saturated fat. Compare that to this one on the right. Linolenic acid is an unsaturated acid, fatty acid. And you'll notice that there are several places where the carbons are attached to each other by a double covalent bond. Double bond, double bond. So these three places are areas where the carbon chain is not saturated with hydrogens. And since it's not saturated, it's called an unsaturated fatty acids. Now, one more thing before we go. The structure of triglycerides. I told you that triglycerides are the most abundant of the fats that are found in our diet or in our body. And they're called triglycerides because it's three fatty acids attached to a glycerol. So here's a glycerol part, 1, 2, 3 fatty acids, triglyceride, right? Now, you'll notice that this is an animal fat. Animal fats are saturated fats. The chains are different lengths, meaning more or fewer carbons, but they're saturated. They've just got as many hydrogens as they can hold. However, here we've got olive oil, and you can see that this one fatty acid making up part of this triglyceride has got a double bond, and that is an unsaturated fatty acid. So this is an unsaturated fat. Saturated fats are generally going to be solid at room temperature. That's why you can leave the butter sitting out on the counter and it stays in a solid form. If you've just cooked some bacon and you leave it in the pan because you don't wash the pan, it will be solid when it cools off. That's because they are saturated fats, whereas the bottle of olive oil in your cupboard will stay liquid because it is an unsaturated fat. Alrighty, we will start here at the beginning of the next lecture.